Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It's the 11th of July, and as always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your local weather information by calling us on the Alaska Weather Information Line, 1-800-472-0391. Find us online at weather.gov/Alaska, or if you can't find what you're looking for, just email me at david.snyder@noaa.gov. On Facebook today, you've probably seen some of the flooding around Squentna. This is one of the river gauges there at Lake Creek along the Yentna River. And you can see how it's come up over the last week or so, and just with recent rainfall and certainly some of the melt of the area glaciers, we've been up around moderate flood stage, around 23.07 feet there, almost 23.1 feet as of earlier today. And the forecast is for this to slowly go down a little bit over the next couple of days. Things should be drying up around the region. The bigger rains will have passed through and conditions should start to improve. But the flooding videos that you've probably seen in the region are certainly impressive. And if you'd like to share any of those pictures with us, we'd be happy to share those here on Alaska Weather as well. We appreciate your reports, and certainly so does the Alaska Pacific River Forecast Center. For right now, a flood warning is in effect around that region. That'll continue through tonight and at least through tomorrow until the floodwaters continue to recede beyond that point. Here's a look at fire danger. As you would expect, with recent rains moving through the Kenai Peninsula and South Central, conditions have eased a little bit across the region, so we're still looking at some elevated fire concerns around the Copper River Valley and up into the eastern Alaska Range by Delta Junction and northward. And we're also talking about extreme fire danger continuing around Fort Yukon and northward into the eastern Brooks Range summits there just about, and certainly westward toward the Fairbanks region. But those conditions have improved somewhat as well. No considerable risk or anything for southeast, southwest, or the west coast itself. So things do seem to be improving with the wetter weather. Of course, it is fairly wet out there compared to how it's been. So big changes all the way around. Anytime you want to check on the conditions in your area, you can certainly head to fire.ak.blm.gov. I'll have a whole host of information about fire conditions. You can also track the day's lightning or go back a couple days and see where things have been going. If you think you smell some smoke, of course, or see that, make sure you report that to your local officials. Here's how the visible satellite picture shapes up over the last 24 hours or so. A broad area of low pressure still covers most of Alaska. Out west, we have a new low forming up across the western Bering Sea, another one hot on its heels to the south, and a wave of moisture working its way across the central and eastern Gulf. This is focusing on the central part of the Panhandle this afternoon. Across south central, a wave of moisture is working its way up across the Kenai Peninsula. It's brought some heavier rainfall across the Anchorage region and into the Susitna Valley. And we've also seen plentiful rain across the interior around the middle Tanana Valley and stretching into the upper Yukon Valley. Another wave has been working through there. This region across Fort Yukon and points east have probably been experiencing some thunder and lightning this afternoon. Looking at the infrared satellite picture, you'll notice a little bit of a shift in the wind up here across the north slope. That's becoming a little bit more of a westerly flow. And that'll be the trend the next couple of days that gradually pushes some of the ice a little bit more northward as we get into the end of the week. Probably a jump of maybe 10 to 20 nautical miles for some of those areas of ice, generally moving away from the coast. So you're going to see some changes there across the Beaufort Seacoast for sure. Here's a look at today's weather, and once again, the better chance for shower and thunderstorm activity is going to be up across the north and eastern quadrant of Alaska today. Rainfall continues across the central Panhandle, rain across the south central coastline and northward into the interior around Fairbanks, and we're also picking up some areas of rain around Kotzebue Sound down toward the YK Delta and into Bristol Bay. Low pressure across the western Bering is spinning up, and you'll notice another wave down to the south as that moves eastward. It drops to about 998 millibars tonight. Showers and thunderstorms will be possible across the central and eastern Brooks Range, probably on an isolated basis. A much better chance that you'll see at least some rainfall and shower activity passing through your region. Out across the west, don't be surprised to see fog around the Bering Strait through St. Lawrence Island down into Nunivak Island, and low pressure also across the North Pacific at 1,004 millibars. As we get into your Thursday, a broad area of low pressure will stretch out across the Brooks Range and into the Chukchi Sea and into central parts of Canada. In fact, along this area, as we start to see more breaks in the cloud cover, there's going to be a better opportunity for those clouds to start bubbling up with the heat of the day, forming showers and maybe even some thunderstorms again. That'll stretch from the eastern Alaska Range all the way up into the central and eastern interior. To the west, our low pressure systems there in the Bering are kind of combining forces, and we're going to get a pretty decent southerly flow wrapping in across the front of that. As this slowly eases eastward and runs into a ridge of high pressure that you notice here, we're going to get a little bit more of a focus for that southerly flow across the west coast and the southwest capes. So the risk of very fast-moving storms probably going away from us as we look at your Thursday here. Here's Friday. And you'll notice that the center of that weather maker is still sitting across the southern Bering, but the front now is kind of detaching from that and moving out ahead of it. So that risk of a really concentrated, strong southwest flow across southwestern Alaska is probably not going to be there as it was looking like could be earlier this week. So that's fairly good. Showers and thunderstorms across the eastern Brooks Range will be possible again for your Friday. A ridge of high pressure moves into the Gulf, and if you're looking for some drier weather across southeast, you may have that with you on Friday, so maybe some more sunshine for you. High pressure is also trying to work its way into the western Bering at 1,018 millibars. That may not be enough to keep rainfall from moving back into the central and western chain, even following this wave of low pressure there across the southern Bering. A broad westerly flow also setting up for the Gulf, so that's going to change the wind pattern a little bit there. Showers continue around Shishmaref up toward Kivalina, Kotzebue. You're probably looking at some wetter Friday weather once again as we get into that westerly flow we were watching across the north slope, and more clouds for the interior. Here's a look at temperatures for your Thursday morning. Most areas in southeast will be back in the lower 50s, upper 40s. Still a cooler start for many in south central all the way down to Kodiak Island, Homer, Seward. As you get into Cordova and most of Prince William Sound will be on that cooler trend to start. Look at the Copper River Basin around Golcana, 44 up toward Glen Allen, 53 for Fort Yukon, lower 50s for the Anchorage area, the Talkeetna area up toward Fairbanks. And then as we get into the North Slope, mid-30s for many there. Nome, you're looking at 46, Southwest also in the mid-40s, St. Paul about 45. Highs on Thursday up to almost 50 degrees for St. Paul, Nunivak Island, Macoriac 54. Fairbanks area closer to 70 degrees, all the way out toward Tanana. Fort Yukon, probably one of the hotter spots again in the lower 70s. The North Slope will have a big change in the temperatures there that you've seen in the last week or so, or more really. Back in the upper 30s to maybe mid-40s west of Utqiagvik and Barrow. Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse, as well as areas eastward, could be pretty warm, pushing 60 degrees there, and you'll see that trend continue. Upper 50s to lower 60s in southeast, and St. Lawrence Island, lower 40s. Overnight lows Friday morning, milder for the north. In fact, many of these temperatures that you'll see in the north will be much closer to daytime highs that you've had recently than anything else. Look at the coastal plain there around Prudhoe Bay, still in the mid-40s overnight. Low 40s to low 50s across south central. Kodiak 51, Bristol Bay temps closer to 50, Sandpoint 51, Dutch Harbor in Unalaska mid 40s, southeast in the 40s and 50s. And high temperatures as we get into Friday. It's going to be a roaster for the north, 50s and 60s there. Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse could be considerably warmer than it's been in a long time. 70 or so around Ambler down to Galena and McGrath. Southwest temperatures back in the mid to upper 50s, south central upper 60s, southeast also warm.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
On to aviation weather now. Not a big change across the north and eastern Gulf Coast. As we were talking about yesterday, there will be limited ceilings and visibility across some of this region as rain continues to pump into the north and eastern Gulf from that low pressure system overall. We're still looking at low starts around the Alaska Range into the Copper River Valley, maybe even an isolated area of convection up across the upper Yukon and south of the Brooks Range. IFR, of course, across the North Slope and across the central and western Bering, then hit and miss across the west coast. More likely you'll run into MVFR than IFR, but there will be some VFR breaks in there as well, and that is pretty much the case for most of the interior north of the Alaska Range and inland from Norton and Kotzebue Sound. For Thursday afternoon, conditions start to break up a little bit more across the central and eastern Gulf and into southeastern Alaska as well. We'll see a few areas of convection across the eastern Alaska Range, the upper Yukon, and the central and perhaps the eastern parts of the Brooks Range. Conditions improve across the North Slope. In fact, VFR sets in across the Beaufort Seacoast, and you'll have lingering areas of IFR and MVFR close to the Chukchi Coast. For the west coast, improvements seen all the way up and down MVFR trying to sneak its way into Kotzebue Sound and Norton Sound, but by and large, a much improved weather during the afternoon, including Bristol Bay. IFR also across the central and eastern chain, the Pacific coast to the Alaska Peninsula, and most of the Bering. As we get into Friday morning, looks like a VFR start for really most of the mainland, all the way from Utqiagvik, Barrow into Norton Sound, Kotzebue Sound, most of southwest in the interior end anyway, looking at VFR, but you'll be looking at MVFR to IFR conditions across parts of the Kuskokwim Delta and into the Alaska Range and parts of the eastern chain again. Look for hit and miss MVFR across most of southeast with VFR to be had. You're also looking at IFR across some of the higher terrain in the northern half of the Panhandle. So we get into the afternoon, once again, convection may fire up across the middle and upper Yukon. Look for the Gulf Coast to flirt with MVFR. The best chance for IFR conditions will be across the western Alaska Range, through the Barren Islands and over Kodiak Island, and generally just outside of Resurrection Bay and south. Across the central and western Bering Sea, including the Pribilofs up to St. Matthew and just west of Nunivak Island, expect IFR conditions there, and then hit and miss across the central and western Aleutians, with by and large mostly MVFR conditions continuing there for your Friday. Here's pass conditions in detail now. Anaktivik Pass and Adigan Pass, we expect to see VFR to start. Should be a nicer day on Thursday. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, we expect to see a transition toward MVFR conditions as the day goes on. Rainy Pass, the start at IFR is in your future, but it looks like MVFR conditions by the end of the day, and continued improvement through Windy Pass as we go through your Thursday. Isabel Pass, the start at IFR, heading for VFR by the end of the day, and Mentasta Pass, marginal conditions most of the day. Watch out for convection to fire up there in the afternoon. For Tanita Pass, not looking for that so much, but we do expect an IFR start with VFR conditions by the afternoon. Portage Pass also looking for IFR, especially on the Prince William Sound side, with improvement to be had. And Chilkoot and White Pass also looking for improvement, even better conditions again as we saw on Friday. Here's your freezing levels, and a cool pocket of air still hovering across the North Slope and across the Copper River Valley into the northern half of southeast and the northern Gulf. Levels there at or even below 6,000 feet. Cooler air still across the central and northern Bering Sea. Levels there at or below 4,000 feet. Those are those two areas of low pressure, obviously, and south of that, levels come up to about 10 to even 12,000 feet across the northern and western Gulf, as well as the North Pacific and the southern Bering Sea. Most areas in the mainland are running at or just about 6,000 feet for the Yukon Valley and into parts of southwestern Alaska. What about icing? Well, that's thinning out a little bit. The main chunks of moisture are starting to move on. Above 10,000 feet on the eastern half, you'll run into some isolated moderate. Some of that could find its way into southeastern Alaska and the eastern Beaufort Seacoast and the eastern Brooks Range. Again, convection may be an issue here and there. As we get into the Norton Sound region and out across the central and western Bering Sea, look for levels there above 8,000 feet, hit and miss across the central and eastern Aleutians. The jet stream has our main body of low pressure across the Bering. The wind speeds converging here south of the Aleutians and pushing air in from the west across the Gulf of Alaska. Another jet max coming across western Alaska and the northern Gulf, 65 to 85 knots, and another push across the Arctic there at 55 knots. A ridge of high pressure sitting across the mainland at the moment, trying to slow things down and bringing winds in a little bit more from the north for southeast. Otherwise, broad southerlies up the west coast, warming things up with wind speeds 50 to 60 knots, westerlies across the north slope. Similar pattern at 3,000 feet, light winds for the interior. A ridge extends into the Gulf, and our main body of southerly moving air anywhere from 10 to about 30 knots. Stronger winds south of the Aleutians up to 50 knots there. Turbulence is to be expected across the chain, the Alaska Peninsula, and Bristol Bay, below 4,000 feet, and some isolated chop across the eastern Alaska Range.
Leatherbacks are the largest turtles on Earth, growing up to 7 feet long and weighing more than 2,000 pounds. These sea turtles are among the most highly migratory animals on Earth, some traveling up to 10,000 miles a year between their nesting and feeding grounds. Prevalent in every ocean except the Arctic and Antarctic, the species overall is declining, more so in the Pacific. In the eastern Pacific, the Mexican population was once thought to be the largest in the world and has experienced an alarming decline.
This trajectory of decline that we've seen and actually collapse. We're talking about only 20 or 30 turtles nesting every year, where thousands used to just 40 years ago. That's the kind of dramatic decline.
The western Pacific population has been declining steadily, and it's particularly critical to act now before it collapses, while there are enough turtles and nests to respond to conservation measures. But threats to all leatherbacks in the Pacific need to be addressed.
The top threats to populations are uncontrolled coastal development, all the bad stuff on the nesting beaches, egg harvest, poaching of the females, predation on the eggs by dogs and pigs. Deforestation makes the sand too warm and dry and the eggs don't hatch. Another one is incidental capture in fishing gear. During their vast migrations, they get caught in fishing gear throughout the Pacific. And finally, marine debris, which the leatherbacks mistake for their favorite food, jellyfish, and they choke on those.
Protecting leatherbacks in U.S. waters alone is not enough to ensure the continued existence of the species. The highly migratory nature of Pacific leatherbacks requires cooperation and international collaboration. NOAA is focusing on partnerships with Mexico, Central America, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands in the Pacific.
Our action plan promotes a holistic recovery strategy that addresses all the sources of mortality. So that's basically ensuring that the remaining nesting sites are protected. And the nests produce as many hatchlings as possible. And then secondly, in tandem with that, is reducing the fisheries-related mortalities. We're working with international partners to incentivize community participation on the nesting beach conservation and developing alternative livelihood programs that wean communities off leatherback resources and introduce alternative methods for food and income. Recovery is going to take a long time, on the order of 20 to 30 years at least, before we see some of these actions bear fruit. But here in the US, we can all help leatherbacks by making seafood choices, for instance, that support sustainable fishing practices. And beachgoers can certainly do their part by keeping our oceans clean of plastic debris, picking up marine litter, particularly plastic bags.
Together with our partners, we are strengthening protection and conservation efforts to ensure a future for leatherbacks, helping them to survive and once again thrive in the waters of the Pacific Ocean.
For over 40 years, NOAA scientists have been collecting data and piecing together the story of the gray whale. Each year, new discoveries are made, revealing the secrets of this ancient traveler. With the northeastern Pacific population recovered, leading scientists from the NOAA Southwest Fisheries Science Center continue their research efforts to help save the western population from extinction. The most effective way to identify individuals and count the population is to photograph them from the surface. Using the gray whale's distinctive markings and gray spots caused by parasites on their skin, scientists document these characteristics to identify individuals.
So we're able to track migratory pathways and corridors by the simple use of photo identification. There are other ways to do that as well, biopsy sampling and genetics.
And from the air.
Aerial photography is one way you can study animals based on their size and shape. So you can learn a lot about nutritive and reproductive condition of whales just by measuring their size and shape from vertical aerial photographs.
You can also put satellite transmitters on them and track them remotely. You put the transmitter on and let them go, and you watch them move across the Pacific or down to China or wherever it might be.
To further learn and discover where these great sojourners swim, the team of researchers traveled to Russia and set up camp on Sakhalin Island.
The main focus of our research while we were on Sakhalin was to collect photo identification. If it was a whale that we had not collected a genetic sample from previously, we would also attempt to collect a sample from the whales.
Whereas whales are endowed with natural insulation, their human observers must gear up to brave the cold in order to study these marine giants up close.
We're typically only able to work about 1/3 of the time that we're there, and that's mostly due to this fog that just invades the area and sits sometimes for weeks on end. So it can be very challenging to try and do field work in this site.
Recently, 2 whales from the western population surprised scientists by migrating across the Pacific to the waters of California and Mexico.
It's a really fun finding. It's added another piece to the puzzle that we didn't previously know about. And I would have to say that it's opened up more questions than we had before.
Research scientists from Japan, Russia, and the United States share images of animals they've spotted.
We take a photograph of an individual off of Sakhalin Island, and we get a phone call from Japanese scientists, and they say, hey, guess what? We've got a picture of a gray whale in Japan. We say, can you send it to us? We'd love to try and match it. They'll send us the picture, we'll compare it to our catalog, and we'll say, hey, we've got a match from Sakhalin to Japan.
Unlike many species of whales that still remain on the endangered species list, the eastern Pacific gray whale, once on the brink of extinction, now numbers about 20,000 individuals. Recovery efforts that started 40 years ago and the ongoing research and monitoring by NOAA scientists have contributed to the conservation of the gray whales. Together, with legal protection and public education, scientists are playing their part to ensure the survival of this magnificent migratory animal.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
On to your sea ice update now. You'll notice that there are some areas along the North Slope that are starting to see some pockets of marginal ice develop. That area should increase over the next week or so for a couple reasons. First of all, it's going to be really warm in the next several days across the North Slope communities. We expect temperatures that could jump at least into the 50s in a few cases, maybe even into the 60s. So there's going to be a lot of heat there. It's also going to have more of a southerly flow developing, which will also aid in the melting. And there are melt pools developing across some of the higher concentrations of thick ice out there. But there is a lot of thick ice out there, and because of that, there may be a patch of multi-year ice that stays a little bit closer to the coastline than in previous years. For the latest information on the forecast, anytime, head to weather.gov/Anchorage/ice. On the southeast now, looking for some light winds from the west and northwest for most areas. The exception, of course, is going to be the Lynn Canal. Southerlies 20 knots with a 4-foot sea there. Otherwise, 6 to 7 foot seas across the coastal areas and the inside passage. 2 to 3 foot seas expected Thursday. For Friday, not a big change. Seas come up about 1 to 2 feet in some areas, so you're looking at about 4 foot seas on the inside and 4 to 5 foot seas, maybe even 6 foot seas as you head down toward the Dixon entrance. Southerlies continue in the Lynn Canal, diminish to about 15 knots with 3 foot seas there. Northwesterlies pick up across the central and southern parts of the inside passage on Friday. For Thursday, light winds around the Kenai Peninsula on either side, Cook Inlet and Prince William Sound, looking at 10 knots. All areas, with the exception of the western Barrens, a southeast flow outside of Kashamak Bay, 15 knots with a 3 foot sea there, and 2 foot seas and light winds inside of Prince William Sound for Thursday. Winds are picking up across the Kenai Peninsula and over Cook Inlet there for Friday. So if you're heading out to do some fishing on boat or by beach, look for a lot more wind, 20 to 30 knots there as you head down the coast, 8 foot seas west of the Barrens, 6 foot seas in the east, 10 to 15 knot winds on either side of Hitchinbrook entrance there, small seas on the inside though thankfully, and 7 foot seas outside of Resurrection Bay, 25 knots coming in from the southeast, so going to be choppy. 10 knots inside of Shelikof Strait for Thursday, look for small seas there, 4 foot seas on the eastern side of Kodiak Island. A southeasterly fetch moving up and over the Alaska Peninsula, 20 to 30 knots there in the Bering Sea coast, expecting 3 foot seas inside of Bristol Bay and 8 foot seas down the Bering Sea coastline, 4 to 6 foot seas for the Pacific, and then winds kick in a little bit more from the south and west as we get toward Friday. 25 to 30 knot winds in all areas. You're looking at seas coming up to 9 feet on the Bering Sea coast and 12 feet there from Sand Point and westward down toward Falls Pass. Seas could be as high as 20 feet in some cases there. That's a brighter blue shade that you see plotted on the ocean there. Across the Kodiak Island region, 4 to 7 foot seas are expected with a south and southeasterly flow, 20 to 25 knots. Across the chain, expecting 30 knots across the eastern end, 20 to 25 for the central and western chain from the west, and then turning to the south and southeast the further east you go along the boundaries there. 8 to 9 foot seas expected for most areas across the Pacific coast. You'll see some of those higher levels there from Nikolsky out toward Unalaska, and then out west of Atka, seas drop off to about 7 to 8 feet there with another slug of higher wind and seas coming in as that low pressure moves, and you can see it. That's exactly what we were looking at just a moment ago as well. That higher region of seas could be as high as 20 feet, but most cases next to the coastline expecting generally about 13 to 14 foot seas at their highest, and seas and winds already diminishing out to the west with that west and southwest flow down to as low as 10 knots, but still as high as 30 knots from Adak to Atka. Across the west coast, south and easterly flow coming up the coastline, 20 to 30 knots. You're looking at 8 to 11 foot seas around the Pribilofs to St. Matthew. Small seas, light winds inside of Norton Sound. Otherwise, 5 to 7 foot seas across the southwestern capes up through Makoryuk and Nunivak Island. For Friday, an offshore flow develops 20 to 25 knots there north of Makoryuk. As you get towards St. Paul and St. George, you have opposing winds there with low pressure sitting right between St. Paul and St. Matthew. A northeasterly flow for St. Matthew, a southwesterly flow over St. Paul and St. George. 8 to 9 foot seas expected in the region there. And for the North Slope, look for light winds blowing offshore 5 to 10 knots, southwesterlies across the Chukchi Sea with generally small seas 1 to 3 feet. As we get into Friday, notice the south winds are picking up 20 to 25 knots with 3 to 6 foot seas. Still got ice across the Beaufort, but the winds will start to chip away at that 15 to 20 knots for your Friday. Let's take a recap of the weather for tonight. Showers across the region with rainfall and maybe a few storms up across the eastern Brooks Range and the upper Yukon Valley. Rainfall for southeast and 2 waves of low pressure out in the west will combine forces as we go through your Thursday and gradually push some drier weather inland. Look for warmer weather up north, increased rainfall for southwest, wind for the eastern Aleutians as well as the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, and increasing rain for south central as we head into the weekend. And southeast starts to catch a break. Look for decreasing cloud cover as you go into your Friday, and warmer weather will follow. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.